Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Developmental Evolution of Fire Emblem panel for EmblemCon 2024. My name is Digital Dreams, and I'll be your host and guide through the changes of Fire Emblem games from development to release. In the next hour, I'll be telling you all about the ways in which various Fire Emblem games have changed from conception to playability. Fire Emblem games spend years being developed before the public finally sees them, and in that time, a lot can change. So we're going to take a look at everything we know changed over the course of these games' development. Like my past panel recordings, this is all going to be done in one take, just like the original panel was. I also have the script included in the description for anyone who would like to read it. Before we go any further, I want to introduce myself properly. I'm a veteran of EmblemCon, and I've hosted 6 past presentations at the other yearly conventions. I've done formal presentations about cut content, glitches, and lost media for the Fire Emblem franchise. All 3 of those panels have been recorded and uploaded on YouTube for easy viewing. Outside of EmblemCon, I'm a writer, and I've written a lot of Fire Emblem content, most notably a rewrite of Fates and over 400 cut Tellius supports. I've been a fan of Fire Emblem for 7 years now, and in that time, I've been packed full of knowledge about this incredible franchise. Now, I want to pass the torch on to all of you by sharing interesting details most people wouldn't know. Fire Emblem has an expansive history in the public eye, and even more out of the view of easy accessibility, and I hope everyone can walk away from this panel with more information about the games we all love so much. First and foremost, I want to explain in detail just what I will be covering in this panel. All of us know about the final products of Fire Emblem development, the mainline and spin-off games. However, in order for us to get to those games, they had to go through lengthy development periods, and in that time, a lot changed both in terms of story and gameplay. I want to go over everything we know changed as these games were brought to life, and since we will be covering the entire franchise, please know that spoilers for every game are to be expected. I will be going over every mainline game in this panel, though some games will have more information than others. For example, we learned a lot about games like Path of Radiance and Shadow Dragon through the Making of Fire Emblem book. Other games, such as Echoes and Engage, were not revealed to the public until they were either finished or very close to it. As such, we don't know as much about them, and their sections will be kept accordingly brief. I'll largely be talking about information we have from promotions, trailers, and books. A lot of this information is readily available on Serenus Forest and the Fire Emblem Wiki, not the fandom one, so if you're curious, you can read more there. This panel will also go over some information found in my Cut Content to Fire Emblem panel from 2021. I won't be getting too deep into any cut content since I've already recorded and uploaded information about that elsewhere, but it will probably come up in passing if it reveals something about the game's development history. If that interests you, then you can check out the video I have posted on YouTube about it. The same applies to lost media under specific cases, though it will come up less than cut content. I don't want either of these to overshadow everything else, so I'm going to keep discussion about them to a minimum while still highlighting what is the most important. So now that all the groundwork has been set, let's get right into things with the first game of the franchise. The first game in the series, Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light, received a lot of attention in the Making of Fire Emblem book. The earliest materials for this game tell us not only how it was developed, but also shed some light on the plan that would later be used for many other games in the series. The first page of development material goes over a lot of basic details about the game. Its title was listed as Battle Fantasy Fire Emblem, while its type was a map-based strategy wargame. There would be 12 terrain types, 22 classes, 63 weapons, and 16 items listed on various pages. The player would lose if the main character was removed from the map or killed. All of this is fairly standard, but there are a few changes. For example, there are 55 weapons and 24 items in the final game, so it seems as if 8 of the weapons changed categorization during development. The Making of Fire Emblem also included some dialogue planned for the game, specifically the dialogue for the end of Chapter 1 with a handful of differences. Talus is referred to as Terra here instead. The king is named Mostin rather than simply King Talus as in the final game. Mostin was actually his name given in early designer notes from Mystery of the Emblem 2, and it's interesting to see that this planned name stretched back even before the third game of the series was conceived. Lastly, this dialogue implies that Grust is the main enemy faction rather than Dolor. Or maybe Dolor just hadn't been exposed as the antagonist yet. Who knows? Next, we have some text from the early version of Chapter 5, and it's under the title of Princess Nina. The text was a bit too long to fit here, though, so if you want to read it, I suggest checking out Serenus Forest's posts on the subject. For the most part, this description is very similar to the final game's Chapter 5 dialogue, with a few tidbits from Chapter 7 mixed in too. The allies recruited in this chapter are where we see notable differences. Nina was meant to be playable, and she was a paladin. In the final game, her role was replaced with Hardin, and she was made a side character. Also, the Arcanean Free Company listed here shares a name with the group of fighters formed by Astrum after the events of this game's remake. Even if the faction name was left out of this game, it was still used many years later. The book also includes an early draft of the game's world map. Here, the continent is referred to as Altesia instead of Arcanea, but the shape and locations are fairly similar to the final version. There were a lot of countries in this early map, though, and the number of nations was trimmed for the final game, presumably for the sake of simplifying things. Given the fact that Arcanea has over 10 countries even with these trims, I think that was a good choice. A few countries changed names too. We already discussed Talus being Terra in the past, but we also have the names Thorikos and Sanitarobe that were clearly changed for the final game. Above Arcanea, you can barely make out the word Altea scribbled out. The name of the continent, originally being Altesia, seems to imply to me that Altea was meant to play a larger role narratively, but this wound up being changed later. Next, let's take a look at some early concept art for dragons. There are two types here: the Earth Dragon Gaia and the Water Dragon Neptune. According to the cut content of the game, Shadow Dragon in the Blade of Light was supposed to have a Water Dragon class, but it wound up being scrapped and left incomplete in the code. Not only that, but there are a lot of cut Dragonstones names and cut dragon species names in the code too, implying that there were many other dragon types that were left on the cutting room floor. Also, it's important to note that the cut dragon types refer to generic enemies. We technically got an Earth Dragon in Medeus and a Divine Dragon in Tiki, but these cut character IDs imply there would have been generic enemies of these dragon clans too. If you could believe it, there was a plan to include cutscene images in this game, but they had to be cut due to memory constraints. There are a few pieces of concept art that would have been still images for cutscene, but they were never brought to life fully. This idea wouldn't return until Blazing Blade 13 years later, where it would be incredibly prominent, but it was planned from the start. The sketch shown here is for Chapter 3 and depicts Julian and Lena. But strangely enough, the cutscene image for the remake of this game doesn't feature them in this chapter's image at all. There's also a note here that implies Jagan was going to die in the first draft of the game, but that didn't end up making it to the final version. I'm glad for that too. Taking away a crutch character in such a brutal way would make the player miserable for a bunch of reasons. Lastly, we have a few more pieces of art. First, we have some rough class designs for things like Cavalier, Lord, and Mage. Second, we have a few old advertisements for the game. The middle image was an early flyer, but it was replaced with a more accurate poster once one had been finished. The rightmost image is the first ever public showing we had of Fire Emblem. It's amazing to see how far the series has come since those days. Time sure does fly, huh? Admittedly, we don't have all that much information about what was originally planned for Gaiden, but wound up being cut. The only really interesting bit we have here is an interview from series creator Shozo Kaga that discusses why Gaiden ended up being the way it is. Gaiden has always been the black sheep of the Fire Emblem franchise, but there are reasons for it, and Kaga outlined them in an interview before the release of Mystery of the Emblem. The layout of the game was meant to address one of the biggest complaints leveled against the first Fire Emblem game: the cumbersome, difficult-to-navigate map interface. Kaga feared that the game came off as more of a regular RPG than a strategy RPG because of the changes made for Gaiden. I still think it feels like a strategy game, but this change and the inclusion of a world map definitely makes the game feel different compared to most things that came before or after it. Another objective of Gaiden was to make the player feel more for the player units than in the previous game. Rather than having a lot of units at your disposal and only being able to raise a select few, Gaiden invites you to use just about every unit you have while thinning the pool of potential units massively. The first Fire Emblem game definitely had an idea of quantity over quality in terms of how well you got to know the characters, but Gaiden is a reverse of that. This game has one of the smallest cast sizes in all of Fire Emblem as a result, and I think that helps a lot with making each character stand out more. And that's about everything we know about Gaiden. Like I said, it's not much, and it's more of talking about what Gaiden wound up being in the end. A lot of the changes in Gaiden that would have marked it as the franchise black sheep came from compensating for the choices made in Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light. I think it's an interesting thing to think about because of how much it changed the game. Mystery of the Emblem is another game we really don't know much about in terms of developmental changes. We've got a pre-release flyer with a few early character images that have changed between the first game and the final version. The characters on the flyer are Marth, Sheeta, Jagan, and Lena. Marth looks a lot like his Shadow Dragon in the Blade of Light art, and Lena is shown in pink robes instead of white. Sheeta and Jagan, on the other hand, look a lot more similar to their final art. The only other pre-release picture we have comes in the form of a screenshot of a conversation between Martha and Lind. Lind's portrait is different between the early and final versions. The text box changed positions for the dialogue scene too. In the background, we can see that the conversation took place on a different part of the map than in the earlier version. This area of the final game features houses, but they're not here in the pre-release iteration. Lastly, there are a few cut content tidbits that highlight changes in development. Riss, Daros, Beck, Roger, Jake, and Goto were all cut from the recap of Book 1 since their recruitment chapters were cut, but they still had data in the game like they were going to be playable in Book 1. The only other interesting piece of cut content is a bit of Axe dialogue that makes it sound as if Medea was going to stay loyal to Hardin. This didn't end up sticking around, but it's still interesting to think about. And a quick water break for me. Next up, Genealogy of the Holy War is one of the games we know the most about in terms of pre-release content. There was a lot discussed about this game after it came out that shed a light on what it was originally planned to be. First and foremost, this game wasn't planned to be a Fire Emblem game at all. Its first name was Holy Sword Elm Kaiser, but this didn't end up sticking. The different name was originally because the game was going to be so fundamentally different from the other Fire Emblem games that it didn't feel right for them to share a name. As development went on, the game became more like the other Fire Emblem games, so it was given the series title back after a brief stint as Sword Emblem. I'm glad we got to Fire Emblem again in the end. This wasn't the end of the journey involving the title, though. In a promotional pamphlet, the game was named Light Inheritors, and while this was not made into the game's final title, it did end up as the name for Chapter 6. The developers thought that the idea of Light Inheritors put too much focus on the second generation, though, especially since the two generations are meant to have equal focus. In the end, they changed the name to Genealogy to reference both generations. The Holy War part of the title was because of the perspective of the main character. Sigurd believes he is fighting a righteous battle, and so the fights are considered holy wars. And that's how we got to Genealogy of the Holy War. There was originally a planned full castle exploration feature like what we see with my castle in Fire Emblem Fates. Back in Genealogy, this feature had to be scrapped due to storage problems that didn't have enough memory to handle something like this. If a Genealogy remake exists, and I'm convinced it does, it had better bring back this feature. Do what the original couldn't do. I know you can do it, Intelligent Systems. We've got lots of gameplay trivia to go over next, starting with the fact that this game was planned to have squad-type combat at one point. The game would have controlled and played more like Advance Wars under this idea, following a 10-person squad system. This was scrapped in favor of traditional Fire Emblem gameplay, but it's still interesting to think about. On the other hand, another feature in Genealogy was added very late into development, the romance feature. This is such a staple of Genealogy these days, but it wasn't added until later on because of the success of dating simulators at the time. This game came very close to being something very different from itself in a lot of small ways. Now it's time for a lot of rapid-fire tiny trivia facts. Originally, Yamka was going to be an axe fighter with few skills, but after Kaga grew attached to him, he became a powerful archer with a lot of skills. Violin's original face design greatly resembled Hannibal, and Sylvia had a different design entirely with blue hair instead of green. We have a cut class here too, a recolored paladin known as Black Knight, which some theorize to be an enemy-exclusive class, while others think it could be a custom class for Ares. This class was cut early enough to not even have data existing in the game, though. The Sage class was originally known as Master Mage, and the Forest class was known as Hero. Lastly, the Thief class was originally known as Treasure Hunter. Okay, now it's time for the real meat of this section. Everything Shozo Kaga said on the now-defunct Fire Emblem forums. Believe it or not, there's a lot here. His original vision for this game was going to be a lot longer, falling in 3 parts instead of 2. The third part would have discussed the aftermath of the main story. Julia's care for Julius would help him to snap free of his possession. On top of that, the parents and children would reunite here. Don't be deceived, though. Very few of the male main characters of Sigurd's army would survive even with this on the mind. Most of the mothers would live to see the second generation, though, and they would meet with their children again here. There were 3 different patterns for parent pairings for the children labeled 0, 1, and 2, and each pattern contained different unions. Furthermore, the children of these pairings would be randomized with only 1 child being born per pairing, and the game would randomly decide if it would be male or female. The exceptions to this rule were Salif, Julia, Leaf, and Altena, since all of them needed to exist for the sake of the story. This was all scrapped when the player was given the ability to pair up the characters for specific marriages, but it remains interesting regardless. There are a lot of other story ideas that wound up going unused in this game that Kaga revealed in his time on the Fire Emblem forums. Going over all of them would take too much more time than I can give it though, so if you're interested, you can check out the page on Serenus Forest about Kaga's comments on the Fire Emblem forums and the old story ideas found therein. More water for me. When it comes to Thracia 776, we've got a few screenshots. The color scheme changed massively between pre-release and final content, making the game a lot darker. In these screenshots, we can see that August used the Dark Mage class in early cutscenes during development. In another early picture from Thracia's website, we can see that Nana was supposed to be explicitly stated as Beowulf's daughter, but all mentions of her father were cut from the final game. A lot of the remaining information we have was revealed by Shozo Kaga on old Fire Emblem forums. Again, the game struggled a lot in its development period because it acts as a midquel to genealogy. Kaga even stated that the game would have been easier to develop if it was an original game rather than existing in Yggdrasil. As such, Thracia wound up letting gameplay take charge instead of relying as much on story as genealogy did. Because of this, a lot of the interesting Thracia development details come from gameplay ideas that wound up being set aside in the final product. The first one was partially implemented while the other two changes were cut entirely. First off, Thracia was going to have around 35 to 40 chapters in total. On a single playthrough, you would go through 20 of these 40 or so chapters. The chapters you didn't play were on branching paths, and you could see them again through replaying the game. Thracia is definitely heavier on route splits than most other Fire Emblem games, so I think traces of this shine through, even if it's not in the final game. The running theme for the other Thracia changes is, strangely enough, statistics. For example, the luck stack was going to be removed from the status screen. It would still exist internally, but the player wouldn't be able to see it. Kaga said it would create an element of uncertainty. In the end, this didn't go through, and I'm glad it didn't. Imagine not being able to see one of your stats while it still impacted your gameplay experience. That would be miserable. Weapons were originally going to have a durability stat, and it would affect the rate of weapon use consumption. For example, if a weapon had a durability stat of 2, it would remove 2 uses from the remaining use of a weapon after just 1 use. Once again, I'm glad this didn't go through. That would have been a little bit too much to manage. And that's about it for Thracia facts. Like I said, a lot of this game's development facts come from random tidbits Kaga shared online, so we don't have as many concrete details. What we do have paints a really interesting picture, even though I'm really glad that those 2 stat changes wound up not going through. Next up, Binding Blade. Oh, Binding Blade. This game had a very rocky development history. This game has 4 known beta builds across 2 consoles, with many more being left as lost, undiscovered media. I covered it in last year's Lost Media Fire Emblem panel, so if you want a more in-depth breakdown of the various builds of Binding Blade, you can check that out. The first in the list is Maiden of Darkness, a game originally planned for the Nintendo 64 Double D. The game was first announced in 1997, but shortly afterward, news on it fell silent. Even in the Fire Emblem Treasure Book released a few years later, there was nothing to speak of about Maiden of Darkness. Unsurprisingly, the game was announced to be cancelled shortly thereafter in 2000. However, we have a little bit of information about Maiden of Darkness. We return once again to the Making a Fire Emblem book since it revealed a lot about Maiden of Darkness. First, we have this screenshot. It uses what would come to be known as the GBA art style, and it has a character resembling Pent, but with Klein's hair. We also have a handful of concept art for this game depicting designs of Roy, who was known as Ike initially, and Idun, with 2 characters who went unused in the final version of Binding Blade, Taki and Helen. Since that's all that was revealed in the Making a Fire Emblem book, though, that's unfortunately all we know about Maiden of Darkness. But Binding Blade's development cycle doesn't end there. No, we have 3 more beta builds to cover, and each one is closer to the final game than the last. The first notable one is from a Famitsu article released in January of 2001. This build contains dynamic health bars resembling swords. It also includes a female enemy mage sprite, something not in the final game where all enemies use male sprites. Another image depicts Alan talking to a villager, and in the background you can see the unused female mercenary sprite that exists in all 3 GBA Fire Emblem games but was never used. This build depicts the same art style as Maiden of Darkness, but adapted to fit the GBA format. However, the UI doesn't look all that similar to the final version. But things start changing with the next major build from Space World 2001. The Space World build is much closer to the final game, but there are still some UI differences. There are some story differences here too. It seems Lilina joined a lot earlier on in this build than in the final game. Also, every weapon image in this build is ported from Thracia 776, likely to be used as placeholders. Other screenshots show a Berserker getting a critical hit against a dragon and Roy fighting an early boss. Speaking of Roy, his design here is wildly different from that of the final game. Why is that? His design was changed to appeal more to younger audiences, though I don't know how much a war game would appeal to children anyway. Regardless, Roy kept his original design in his map sprite even if his portrait was changed to reflect his newer design. His design was solidified just a handful of days before Super Smash Bros. Melee released in Japan, so it was clearly a point of contention throughout development. There's yet another build that depicts an early version of Chapter 2, though this one is far closer to the final release of the game. The main difference is that the coloring is a lot darker than in the final game. Aside from that, a lot of things here seem to be the same. That's the last concrete build we have for the game, but the Making of Fire Emblem book revealed a lot more that goes beyond just early builds for the game. Binding Blade was originally going to revolutionize the weapon triangle as we know it by adding new bonuses to having a weapon triangle advantage. The triangle itself was going to be the same of sword beating axe beating lance, and lance beating sword. However, depending on the weapon type with the advantage, the character with that weapon would have a special combat bonus. For example, if you wielded a sword against an axe unit, you would have a guaranteed double attack. If you wielded a lance against a sword unit, you would always strike first. If you wielded an axe against a lance unit, you would negate the enemy's defense. On top of that, if an unpromoted unit was facing a promoted unit, their weapon triangle advantage would be negated because of the promoted unit's superiority in combat. These changes were ultimately scrapped, and I can only assume it was because of how unbalanced it could be, especially if you used an axe. In the end, we wound up getting the traditional hit rate bonuses known in other games instead, and I can't help but feel this was for the best, even if the original plan would have been really interesting. There was a different structure planned for the game's story initially. There were 24 chapters in a monomyth structure, a story type about a hero traveling to another land to overcome adversity and then return home stronger than before. To reach this goal, the story was split in 2 parts of 12 chapters each. The first half would focus on adversity, while the second half would focus on a counteroffensive. Within these story parts were subphases. Chapters 1 through 3 were an introduction showing the fall of the hero's world. Chapters 4 through 8 detailed an escape after the downfall of Lycia in an attempt to gather allies. Chapters 9 through 12 would involve searching for a new home, and apparently would end with the hero being crowned king. This implies Roy's promotion was going to be a lot sooner initially. Oh, don't we all wish? The latter half of the story is a lot less detailed, and we have to break this down for ourselves. Chapters 13 through 16 focused on the restoration of Etruria and the defeat of the first general of Bern. Chapters 17 through 20 discuss the liberation of Ilia and the defeat of the second general. Lastly, chapters 21 through 24 heralded the end of Bern. There's a much more detailed breakdown of this on Serenus Forest, and I highly suggest you check it out, but that's the gist of it. Notably, this structure does not include any side quest chapters or the route splits in the Western Isles or going Sake over Ilia. This version of the game follows the A routes exclusively, focusing on Laram and Ilia's paths at the route splits. It seems that both the route splits and the side quests were thought of later in development. At its core, though, the game remained the same, with the most important chapters in the story, 1, 8, 13, 16, 20, and 24, being ported over wholesale into the final game from the initial draft. These chapters even have the same names as the original outline. This outline also gives us a list of classes on of the characters recruited in each chapters. We don't have the names in the book, but we do have the classes listed out. Interestingly, there are only 40 characters in this outline, but 54 in the final game. There are a lot less promoted units too, 9 in the draft and 15 in the final release. In a Q&A session about Path of Radiance, the developers explained that they were aiming to have female units for each class in Binding Blade, and that was likely what boosted the unit total so high. Also, this original draft had 3 Myrmidons, but no mercenaries. However, there was a promoted hero, so maybe Myrmidons originally promoted into heroes. It's interesting to theorize about, if nothing else. There were no bandits either, and instead a third fighter in Chapter 10. One of the strangest notes here is that there are 2 sages who joined in Chapters 19 and 23. In the final game, there are no recruitable promoted sages. The first one was likely Nime, given the appearance time. Perhaps the second sage was meant to be like Athos was in Blazing Blade. Only Yoder would fit this description, but he's a bishop in the final version. The last thing to note is that there was apparently a recruitable Wyvern Lord in Chapter 21, and I suspect this to have originally been Gaul. There are rumors from supposedly intelligence systems information that would imply that he was going to be playable originally, so this makes a lot of sense. I promise we're almost done with Binding Blade. Our last notable tidbit is a map of Alib. It looks fairly similar to the map of the final game, save for one major difference. An island south of Lycia is named as Kos here, but in Blazing Blade it is stated to be called Valor. Also, a handful of characters are scribbled down in either the country they come from or the country they are recruited in. Since the pre-Pegasus Knight sisters are all named in Ilia, though, it seems to be talking about nationality. Barter's name shows up in both the Western Isles and Sakai, strangely enough. Could he possess heritage from both nations, or was one of the names simply mistranslated? We have a few unknown characters here too, such as Jan and Bor from Ilia, and a few other vague scribbles. Another note elsewhere in the book refers to a paladin by the name of Iger, but we know nothing else about her. This map implies that Douglas originally came from Bern and not Etruria, while OJ and Laram came from Nevada. Chad was from the Western Isles, while Garrett was from the island of Kos that would become Valor. Lastly, Lilina was originally named Lilia, and Elfin and Mildane were separate characters instead of one being an alias for the other. As our last bit of Binding Blade information before we move on, this game was originally going to have an English release. Yep, that's right. Binding Blade was supposed to be the first game in the Fire Emblem series to go international. We don't know how deep this was in development before it was cancelled, but it was confirmed by intelligence systems to be in development. In the end, the English release was quietly shelved, and Blazing Blade wound up being the first international game in its place. What a shame. Oh, I'm doing so much talking. When it comes to Blazing Blade, we have something special to tell us more about it, but first, we have a few brief flyover details to get through. Starting out, there was originally a playable warrior in Lynn's story. Maybe it was Geitz? No one knows for sure. Speaking of Lynn, her name was originally Alicia, and Carla was originally known as Anis. Wrath had originally had a battle conversation with Uhai in Chapter 18, but it was cut since he was recruited later in the game than that chapter. Similarly, Heath was said to be recruited from a village in Chapter 20, but this was later changed. Lastly, the song Prologue from Sacred Stones was originally planned for this game, likely as Lynn's second map theme, but it was later pushed back to be in the third and final GBA Fire Emblem game. Okay, now that the basics are out of the way, let's get into the real meat of this section. Blazing Blade is a special game when it comes to cut content because we have two leaked prototypes from the game's development. After a data leak in 2008, two builds of Blazing Blade, known as 0206 and 0219, were found. These prototypes stand for February 6th and February 19th, and they show us the development of the game at these two dates. They give us a lot of information to cover, so let's get right into it. The first interesting thing about these prototypes is that they show us the early versions of the CG images used in the story. The art is in varying stages of completion, with the early game pictures tending to be more complete than the later images. All of the pictures in the prototype lack the grainy sepia layer that has come to be normal for the CG images in this game, and some of them are just sketches. It's very interesting to see how far these pictures have come, and if you're curious, I highly suggest checking out the Serenus Forest image gallery for the prototype to see how the art started out. Next up, let's get into portraits and sprites. Eliwood, Lynn, and Hector all have slightly different sprites, most notably seen with Eliwood's sad sprite. Other characters have more drastic changes, such as Raven with gray hair and Heath with red hair. The boss character Ion has Kenneth's portrait instead of his own. A lot of characters use the default blue color palette for their battle sprites since they don't have custom color schemes yet. The Knight Lord class has different animations when using Durandal, and most notably seen in the critical attack. The dancer rings all have ribbon icons here instead of rings, and they can only be used from the items menu. In terms of gameplay changes, there are extra shops and houses on a handful of maps. There are also a lot of enemy units in different places, and most of the time, they're completely wrong. Some items had different stats, and a handful of items, like Vida's Uber Spear, the Earth Seal, the Emblem Seal, and the Wind Sword, are all outright missing. Hard mode was originally called Professional mode. Nils and Natalie both have stat screens when collapsed, but viewing them crashes the game. In Chapter 19X, Nurgle is erroneously added as a playable character, and his stat screen also freezes the game. Erish Kigal is also broken, and instead of having infinite durability, it has 0 durability and breaks after 1 use. In the prototype, magic damage uses an entirely different formula of the user's magic times 0.5 instead of magic times 1. I'm very happy that was changed for the final release. How could my mage just steamroll the game if their damage output is cut in half? Lastly, let's go over some of the changes between the two prototypes. Since they come from about 2 weeks away from each other, there are a handful of things that changed from 206 to 219, even if a lot of it is the same. The title screen is a little bit different between them, and there are a lot of missing symbols in 0206 that are replaced with a heart instead. There are a lot fewer music tracks in 206 too. The final chapter has a different tile set in 206 and even has Fog of War, and sometimes the door to the final room will not open, leading to a softlocked. Lastly, Fargus is a general in 206, but a berserker in 219. I really love the prototypes for Blazing Blade because of how much they tell us about the ways in which this game changed. If you're interested, I highly recommend digging into the prototypes more on your own to learn about them. They're actually playable, and there are ROMs freely available online. There's a lot of cool stuff here that I wasn't able to cover, but you'll have a blast with the prototypes. And we're not finished with leaked prototypes just yet. Sacred Stones is another game that we have a lot of pre-release information about because of a prototype being leaked. Before we jump into that, though, I want to cover some changes we have in screenshots from other places, such as magazines and the game's official website. One picture depicts an item called the Stone Shard. This is a common occurrence in the pre-release material, including the prototype build. The Stone Shard acts as a temporary monster weapon, and to prove it, it uses the icon for Flame Tongue. In the final game, this item still exists, but it has been given the icon of a red gem and has very little in the way of practical functionality. It still works, but it's not on the same level of importance it once was. Another picture shows what seems to be an early draft of the prologue map. It features a lone cavalier in a village, and both of these are notably different in the final release. The tile layout is different too, but it maintains the same general idea of a map sitting in between two mountains. The clear condition would have involved seizing the house instead of defeating the boss, a marked difference from the final release. Water bottle's making noise, my apologies. The next image shows an early version of the Great Knight class with a different color scheme and sprite. The Great Knight lacks a shield, and the saddle is red. Another image shows that at the time these pictures were taken and shared, no character had custom color palettes yet and just used the default blue. The third picture shows Chapter 2, with Erica being accompanied by a female Myrmidon and Druid. Neither one of these classes is available on this map in the final version, and the boss has been moved to a different location as well. The last picture here shows Tethys to use Ninian's dancer sprite before she was given her own, and you can barely make it out in the background around the text box. Next up, we have some monster talk. There were a few magazine scans that showed concept art for some of the monsters, specifically the Mouth Dog and the Elder Bale. This concept art was never released outside of this low-quality magazine scan. Speaking of monsters, a Malduin can be seen inside the Tower of Volney on its first floor in another picture from the website, but this is impossible in the final game. The Cleric map sprite is also a placeholder and different from the version we got in the final release. Okay, now that all the promotional material is out of the way, let's get into the real heavy hitter, the prototype. Much like with Blazing Blade, Sacred Stones had a prototype leak when Intelligent Systems suffered a massive data leak back in October 2008. We only have one Sacred Stones prototype compared to the two from Blazing Blade, though. There are quite a few differences between the prototype and the retail versions of the game. For one, this version of the game is filled to the brim with placeholder graphics, most of them being ported from Blazing Blade. Erica's battle animations are very different here from the final version too, and she critical hits by using her weapon with 2 hands instead of 1. A lot of the character portraits are slightly different from the final version, but some are far more drastic, as you can see here with Kylan Ford, who outright switched Christmas Cavalier colors between the prototype and final release. There are a lot of other changes that go beyond just different graphics, though. For one, Amelia has Tana's role in the story, and she was planned to be a flying trainee unit. In the end, Tana was slotted in her place, and Amelia was made into a trainee unit, albeit one that walks instead of flies. La Rochelle has a version of Tana's portrait, and Tethys uses a variation of Naimi's portrait. A handful of characters have different classes here too, including Tana, who was originally planned as a general. It seems like Tana, as we know her today, wound up changing a lot over the course of the development cycle after this prototype, and that she and Amelia swapped places. Tana isn't the only one who changed, though. Naimi's beta name was Mary, while Garcia's was Borbo. Ephraim's planned name was Urzak, as we can see in a handful of debug menus. A handful of world map locations have different names, and a few battle maps have different layouts. Lastly, there was a Wyvern Rider by the name of Nate planned, but he was cut later on. This prototype also shows us what the story was going to be like up through Chapter 8, and there are quite a few changes here, especially in Chapter 6. After Erica hands over her bracelet in Chapter 6, the Grotto soldiers kill the civilians despite her surrender. The bloodshed only ended when Sele arrived to kill the boss with a critical hit. Chapter 7 was planned to have alternating fog of war similar to the rain and no rain feature from Blazing Blade, and Seth was going to warn the player of when the fog was set to arrive again. The Chapter 8 boss was known as Jude Rubert, who was one of Grotto's 7 generals. His title was Obsidian, and this is Dussel's title in the final version. After Chapter 8, we have no more story events or dialogue to look through. However, there are a few other details that go beyond Chapter 8. The prototype was planning on having Erica promote at the start of Chapter 17, and the final map was supposed to consist of just one map instead of 2 like it does in the final game. Chapters 5X and 11 were absent originally too, seemingly added in later for both routes. This prototype offers us an interesting look into what could have been for Sacred Stones. If anyone is curious, the prototype is once again freely available online, and I highly encourage you to check it out for yourself if you're interested enough to dig deeper. I love being hydrated. It's time to venture back onto home consoles with Path of Radiance. This is another game we have a lot of information about, but this time it's because of the Making a Fire Emblem book, and it reveals a lot about Path of Radiance's early plans for the story. But before we get into that, we have a few gameplay matters to get through. First, an early screenshot referred to Ike as Paris, and he was fighting a soldier of Daros. Paris is Ike's beta name, and it was later reused as Priyan's Japanese name. Speaking of Ike, his personal weapon was originally the rapier, followed by the long sword, instead of the regal sword like in the final game. The status screens were very different early on. Titania's initial class was Lance Knight, but in the final game she's an axe-focused paladin instead. The battle stats also used to be visible in combat, only for this to be removed later on. This was actually true of a lot of demos of Path of Radiance, so the change to take stats out of the combat screen was made pretty late into development. Now that the gameplay tidbits are out of the way, let's get right into the heat of this section with the information from the Making a Fire Emblem book. This book tells us a lot about Path of Radiance's early stages of development, including a feature that was planned initially but scrapped later on in development. This feature was a fully traversable map of the base the player visits in between chapters. Remember that? This idea later resurfaced as the My Castle in Fire Emblem Fates, but the concept was fairly fleshed out here in Path of Radiance. There were even facilities planned out that you could visit. The War Room would send you to the next chapter. The Convoy would be a place to manage your item inventory. The Barracks would feature the game's settings and the ability to save the game. The Records Hall showed off the status of characters, play records, and a character relationship chart. And a Memorial Hall was unlocked after beating the game. The Armory, Vendor, and Forge were carried over into the final game. Lastly, there was a mysterious auction hall and an arena that likely would have functioned similar to the other Fire Emblem games. In the end, all of these but the Armory, Vendor, and Forge were axed. The character relationship chart wound up being shelved until Radiant Dawn and was established there, but it's interesting that it was originally planned for this game. The meat of this section comes from the 5 character profiles in the book. First, we have Leanne. Interestingly, this section implies that she was originally meant to have a relationship with Tibarn instead of Naysala, who is referred to as Kilga here. Naysala being mentioned, even by a different name, is interesting given some changes to the world map made before release. Kilvas was originally absent, and there were other territories, Est, Razia, Selenos, and Persis there instead. Selenos was the early name for Serenus Forest, and Sephron's domain of Persis was later made a territory of Benyon instead of a country all its own. But back to Leanne's profile, it has a few other curiosities, such as how she was one of 10 Heron children in the royal family. She also lost her voice due to the trauma of the Serenus massacre here and lived in Phoenicius afterward instead of being laid to rest in Serenus. In the game, Leanne can speak, but she can only talk in the ancient tongue until Part 2 of Radiant Dawn. Her lack of speech in this initial draft implies that she would be unable to sing at the Serenus altar later on, which would change that part of the story significantly. The next profile for us to look at is Stefan. First and foremost, his bio outright states that he is a descendant of the 3 heroes, though it seems to imply Bjork lineage rather than Laguz as in the final game. He's also fiercely loyal to Benyon, or more specifically, Soniki, even viewing her as his liege. The most interesting fact here, though, is the outright mention of Yune in Path of Radiance content. Everyone seems to have known Yune by name in this version of the story, instead of her being a closely guarded secret like in the final version. The unused content of Path of Radiance implies that Yune was planned to show up in this game, so this original bio proves that theory well. It's a stark departure from the final product, but it's definitely interesting. The next 3 profiles have a lot of information about the story, and we're kicking off this massive trio with Ike. A lot of notable things are here. For one, Ike's backstory is very different, and the entire family was nobility originally, with his father being charged with treason and executed when Ike was 12. His mother went missing shortly afterward, leaving Titania to head the creation of the mercenary company that came from survivors of his father's old territory of Thebes within the Duchy of Persis. Benyon also appears to have gone by the name Babylon in this early version of the draft. Titania was the head of the mercenary company in Grail's place, and the company consisted of vassals from Thebes, and Ike first took to combat at 17. Ike now searches for the truth behind his father's execution and his house's downfall to restore the family honor. Ike's mother's fate is left up in the air, and she was the adopted daughter of Duke Persis, implying that he was pulling the strings just as Sephirin did in the final game. On top of that, Elena's name in the Japanese version is very similar to Leiron, Sephiron's real name. Her name is Eruna in the Japanese version, while Leiron's Japanese name is Erunen, with just an extra N at the end. Maybe her name is a leftover from when she was Duke Persis' adoptive daughter. Regardless of other theories, wow, this entire profile is a massive departure from the final game. And Mist continues with a lot of the changes outlined in Ike's profile. First off, Ike and Mist were supposed to split the protagonist role, much like Erica and Ephraim in Sacred Stones, with the game likely changing depending on which leading character you picked. If she is chosen as the protagonist, Mist takes over the operations of the mercenary company after Ike is injured in battle. It's impossible to say for sure if Mist was going to be the permanent protagonist or if this would be temporary until Ike got back on his feet. She was originally a Lord class just like Ike, but she was supposed to use magic instead of physical weapons. Interestingly, Mist was originally meant to be a nickname instead of her full name. Her full name likely would have been a longer and fancier name to go along with her status as a noblewoman. And the last profile of the bunch belongs to Titania. She started out as a great knight that used axes and lances, but in the final game she was made into a paladin. Titania was born into a knight family that served Ike and Mist's father, and she was knighted at 15. After her liege was executed for treason, Titania escaped with Ike and Mist. She would later create the mercenary company from the vassals of their father's territory, and from there she would hand control of the mercenary company over to Ike once he was old enough. She aims to protect her liege's orphans and hopefully restore the honor of her house one day. Titania's role is largely what you would expect from these new circumstances, but I still think it's really cool. I'm happy with the final story we got for Path of Radiance and Radiant Dawn, but this early draft piques my interest anyway. I would love to hear more about it one day if there's any other information that can be shared beyond these early draft details. When it comes to Radiant Dawn, we really don't know all that much about the game prior to release. We've got a few low-quality images of the game's hands-on previews, but that's about all I can say. However, I'm going to analyze those 3 images with everything I've got. First off, the title screen looked very different originally, including Bracknell, Alondite, and Leiron's medallion together. Next, it seems there was originally a plan for Micaiah to fight Cainagus. I'm glad that didn't end up happening. I can't say it would have ended well for her. Lastly, we have a low-quality preview of Nolan's original sprite, and, sheesh. I'm glad we wound up getting the final version. He's staring into my soul in this drafted version. I imagine there were other pictures from this hands-on preview, but I couldn't find them anywhere, so these 3 images are going to have to do. As one last little fact before we move on, I noticed something in the E3 2007 trailer for this game. A lot of text was translated into English. All but the critical hit cut-in you can see with Ileana in the corner of the screen. It's small, but I'm glad they cut that before the game shipped out. That would have been embarrassing to leave in. Radiant Dawn may not have given us much in other places, but its content tells us a lot. First, there were a few unused items like the Tempest and Serenity skill scrolls. We also have mines, slim lances, and a dark magic attack for Ashera here. The funniest unused item to me, though, is Selgius's warp powder that just has the description, "If this appears, it's a bug. Report it." Speaking of Zelgius, he's an unused unit here too, though he's statistically identical to the Black Knight. He uses swords and lances, and he has fully functioning battle animations when hacked in too. Radiant Dawn's real intrigue and content comes from its unused music. There are over 50 unused music titles in this game, including a remix of Alm's second battle theme from Gaiden. If you haven't already heard it, please look it up. It's fantastic and freely available online. I have a minor theory for the unused music, though. The bandit theme in this game, Aesthetics of Deprivation, feels a bit lacking. It's like there's something missing, but you can't quite put a finger on what. Well, I can tell you. There was a longer version of it in the game that included a violin melody. In the end, the violin melody was axed, and the song is a lot shorter. I really liked the long version, and it's a shame it wound up being cut. I think this was a mistake on the developer's part, but it's something that really needs to be focused on because the song is incredible. And the last piece of information about Radiant Dawn, we have the most frustrating thing ever. This game was supposed to have support conversations. In fact, there were over 300 support conversations planned, each of them with an empty script file and no text in the final game. The system of everyone being able to support everyone was still planned, but characters would have special A-rank conversations with specific characters. In the end, this didn't happen, and yeah, it sucks. I said before that I wrote cut support conversations for Tellius, right? This is what I was talking about. Why couldn't intelligent systems do this for us? Radiant Dawn needed it so badly. When it comes to Shadow Dragon, we really don't know all that much about how this game changed over the course of development. What we do have comes largely from the game's cut content. There are a handful of interesting tidbits from the game's code, most of them focusing around game mechanics. For example, this game was originally planned to have an order function like in Path of Radiance and Radiant Dawn. This was scrapped, but the code for ordering your army after certain attack patterns still exists in the game. There's even a tutorial for it that exists in international releases. We also have data for cavaliers dismounting from their horses, implying that the dismounting was planned to be a mechanic in this game. Much like with the order function, this was cut, but remains in the game's data as a relic of what could have been. And the most interesting piece of developmental information in this game's code comes from the scrapped My Unit feature. Yeah, you heard that right. The first ever My Unit was supposed to come in Shadow Dragon, not New Mystery. In the end, this was completely cut and left out until New Mystery came out, but since then it has become something of a series staple. There are code strings for My Unit and My Unit registration, but these were both left on the cutting room floor. I imagine customization would have gone largely the same way it did in New Mystery of the Emblem, where you can choose your character's hairstyle, hair color, and more. After all, there exists data for women with blonde and purple hair in the game's code, despite there not being any playable units in the game who fall under those descriptions. I imagine they exist for the sake of My Unit customization, but since that went scrapped, these two hair colors went unused. New Mystery of the Emblem spent a long time in development, but we didn't know it was coming until 2 months prior to its release in July of 2010. As such, there's not much to pull from in terms of pre-release content. But there are a few background details to note here. First off, this was the first game in the series to include casual mode, a discussion that had dated all the way back to genealogy. After many debates back and forth about it, Intelligent Systems decided to keep it when playtesters enjoyed having the casual option. This is also the reason we wound up with so many infamous difficulty settings in this game. The only other interesting pieces of information here come from cut content. First, it seems that Norn was originally planned to be playable in the prologue. She's a piece of dialogue where she says goodbye to Chris like all of the other playable units in the prologue, and she has retreat dialogue specifically from the prologue. Second, Goto was planned to be playable, and he had both retreat and death quotes despite not being a playable character in the final game. Neither of these ever came to reality, but I still think it's intriguing to think about. Next up, we have Awakening. We've got quite a few interesting Awakening tidbits from early promotional screenshots. First off, early images of the game show various characters with different sprites. Most notably is Lissa, who is yellow here instead of blue. I can only assume her color scheme was changed so as to not confuse any of the players. In the same image, we can see that Sully, Stahl, and Virion used generic Cavalier and Archer sprites before their personalized sprites were completed. The text box here is a lot less detailed than the final game, and Robin's sprite looks very different from the final game. His name is Jace in this image, too. Lastly, the shadow effect at the top and bottom of the screen had not yet been implemented in this image. Critical hit cut-ins looked very different in earlier versions of the game, too. This earlier draft focuses on the character's full face instead of focusing in on the eyes. The shading of Lonku's sprite is very different too. You might not know this, but the full versions of the portraits used for the critical hit cut-ins still exist in the code. They're cropped for the cut-in, but the full portraits are still there even though they go largely unshown. And the new portraits are very different from the original critical hit cut-ins for both Lonku and Frederick. Another set of old screenshots shows that Sumia and Muriel also used generic sprites before their personalized ones were finished. One picture shows Sumia as a cavalier, a class that she, strangely enough, cannot have in the final version. There's also an image from the US English release that shows the Chapter 1 boss's name as Grendel instead of Garrick. This seems to have been changed incredibly quickly, though, so this wasn't around for much longer than the trailer it appeared in. Lastly, we have an image that shows a different world map. Crom previously stood right on locations instead of on a small white circle next to the location. And lastly, we've got a few pictures from very early on in development. The first known image of the game shows a scrapped graphics system where the sprites on the map would become more detailed as the player zoomed in. This was clearly cut, but it's very interesting to think about. This image also does not depict any of the maps in the game, so it could have been an early testing map. The arena resembles Arena Ferox, though, so maybe arenas were going to be on the map like in the GBA Fire Emblem games. I suppose we'll never know, though. Another early image shows that during development, generic enemies used a placeholder silhouette sprite. It seems to be an edited version of a villager portrait from the final game. This is also not the same portrait used as the Mirage units in the Wellspring of Truth DLC. This was just a placeholder, and obviously it was cut out by the time the game released. Still, it's nice to see little relics of development from old images of the game. All things considered, we don't have much in the way of pre-release information about Fates. Every preview of the game seems to use the final version, or at the very least, something pretty close to it. The most information we have comes from the Making of Fire Emblem book, and we've got a few tidbits about how the story changed in development. First and most notably, Hinoka did not exist in the first draft of the game. She was a character drawn up by the game's artist, Yusuke Kozaki, and her design was such a hit that she was made one of the main characters in the game. Her last-minute inclusion explains a lot about why she does so little in the story. Rumor has it that Kagero was originally the older Hoshidan's sister, but after Hinoka was created, she was reassigned as Ryoma's retainer. There were other changes in regards to the royals, too. Takumi's name was originally Takuma, and his hair was red early on in development. Camilla and Sakura also had different personalities, with Camilla adopting a new speech partner after she, quote-unquote, snaps at people and loses her patience. Sakura was also stated to be more cheerful, originally acting closer to Elise than her final iteration. For the last big change, Hisame was originally conceived as Hinata's twin brother. This was ultimately scrapped because of how samurai-heavy Hoshido was. Having four samurai was a bit much, so Hisame was made into a child unit instead to balance things out. The Making of Fire Emblem book also featured an early draft of Chapter 15 of Birthright. While the bulk of it is the same, there are a few changes. A scrapped character named Matheus accompanied Scarlet and Corrin up Mount Garou. Instead of the Wolfskin, the Hoshidan army would run into the Lightning Tribe. This makes a lot of sense, actually. If there was a Lightning Tribe in Nor, then that would put two of the tribes in Hoshido into a Nor. It also makes a lot more sense than the 2-in-1 split we got in the final game. Plus, it would cover 4 common elements in RPGs: fire, ice, lightning, and wind. Apparently, the Wolfskin were added because rendering the lightning attacks was an issue in the game's engine. I have to wonder if Matheus could have had something to do with the Lightning Tribe, but right now, that's only speculation. In this chapter, Corrin would have been pushed off a cliff due to the recoil of an attack they took while trying to defend Takumi. Lilith would have come to their rescue instead of Hinoka, since at this time of the early script, Hinoka had not yet been created. Speaking of cliffs, this script draft features Kaze's sacrifice to save Corrin. But it doesn't have the option to save Kaze at all. Maybe that was added later on in development. I'm glad they added it in the end. I absolutely hated that plot point, and I know many others did too. Lastly, we have a few bits of miscellaneous trivia. Raijinto, Siegfried, Brynhilder, and Fujin Yumi's abilities are themed after the sun, moon, earth, and sky, respectively. Anankos originally did not have a Buddha's mask in this universe, but the people of Bala carved his face when he was at his most beautiful, and that's how he got it. Later, the mask was put on when he was buried. On the subject of dragons, we got some more lore about them too. Dragons' bodies contain immense power even in death, and this can cause plants to grow from their corpses. The military from Awakening and Anankos' body creating Castle Gygus were meant to be examples of this. I really like these pieces of information about Fate's development. I would love to learn more about what was planned for the game but was left on the cutting room floor, and I hope we get the opportunity to dig more into it one day. Tell us your secrets, intelligence systems. We would love to hear them. I highlighted Echoes at the start of this panel as one of the games we know the least about in terms of pre-release information. The game was announced in January of 2017, and it was released just 3 months later in April of that same year. The game was essentially finished by the time we knew about it, so there's not all that much to share about it. There are a few minor oddities from the first few previews of the game in the final product, though. For example, Silk is shown in the Sage class, even though she cannot take on this class in the final game. Similarly, Mei uses the Excalibur spell despite it not being in her spell pool. Lastly, there are a few enemies in the trailer that seem to use the wrong name. Instead of being called enemies, they're called Alm's Army. This was fixed before the final release, but that's still a very funny mistake to make. The only thing that could clue us in as to something that changed during Echo's development is a piece of cut content. Both Berkut and Fernand have nearly complete sets of voice clips and text strings specifically tied to being playable units. They lack support conversations or character endings, but they have too many voice lines for it to be a coincidence. It's important to know that Fernand is playable in a few of the Rise of the Deliverance DLC maps, but a lot of his voice clips go unused even still. If Berkut and Fernand were planned to be playable, these ideas were cut fairly early on, though, since they don't have base stats or growths. However, Fernand has an interesting quality here. All of his enemy appearances refer to him as an enemy in the code, and this is something that only happens with other characters that are recruited from the enemy faction. In other words, he has this in common with Delthea, Zeke, Sonia, and Dean. Berkut doesn't have this trait, though. The evidence about Fernand and Berkut being playable at one point is kind of hit or miss, but it's the main developmental detail we have for this game. Three Houses is a game we know quite a bit about in terms of developmental changes because most modern fans saw the shift in real time. The trailers to show how far the game has come are still online for easy access. The first trailer from E3 2018 came out more than a year after the game's announcement and was our first true taste of the game. There are a lot of changes between this trailer and the final game, and they become apparent as soon as the video begins. For one, the font is very different from the final game. The battle menu is different too, and the commands for attack and magic are split up. From this early version of the mock battle, we can see Edelgard has a full model, but none of the other students save for Dimitri or Claude have full models. This trailer shows Mercedes as having brown hair and a generic cleric model. Interestingly, all of Edelgard's sprites show her as having light blonde hair instead of white. Hilda also has an early version of her sprite, and Ash is with the Golden Deer in the mock battle. Maybe he was a placeholder until Ignaz's sprite was finished? I don't think he was ever planned for the Golden Deer house because of how plot important it is that he's a blue lion. In fact, we even see students fighting against Gaspard trailers in the trailer. One of the biggest shifts in this trailer is the inclusion of the formation mechanic in the battle menu. Cut voice lines from Geralt imply that the formation mechanic was the predecessor to Gambits. We can see Dimitri activate a formation in this trailer, and it seems to function fairly similarly to Gambits, and I suspect it was probably a bit different too, though. Formations were changed to Gambits by the time of the second trailer for the game in early 2019, so we don't know all that much about them beyond what we see here. And speaking of the early 2019 trailer, it shows us a version of the game much closer to the final release than the previous one. The world map has been updated to match what we know in the actual game, and all sorts of things have been renamed, including formations becoming gambits. Magic has been condensed into the attack menu, and attack is also referred to as ATK on the battle menu. The trailer also has a lot of differences from the final game, mostly in terms of small translations. There are too many differences for me to go over here, but a lot of tiny changes were made in the transition between the 2018 trailer, the early 2019 trailer, and the game's release in summer of 2019. The final trailer of the game from E3 2019 is very similar to the final game, with very few differences as finishing touches before release. The most notable one comes from some gameplay footage from after the trailer, and it shows that all battalions of a different movement type would be changed when a character reclassed to a different movement type. In the final game, the only restriction on this is with flying battalions being unable to be equipped on any other movement type, and flying units can only have flying battalions. Aside from that, the final game is very similar to this trailer from the month before the game's release. Three Houses is a lot of cut content, though, and some of it implies changes over the course of development. The first of these strange pieces of cut content comes in the form of unused unit versions of Geralt, Rhea, and Sothis. They have full stats, caps, dialogue clips, and growth rates like they were going to be playable at one point. I don't know if this was for the sake of completion or if they were actually going to be used, but I still think it's cool. The cut content of Three Houses also tells us about a cut feature plan for the game. horse racing. There are NPCs to match up with the horse racing feature, and we even have a few icons for horse racing and a handful of other monastery activities such as trading and certifying for classes while exploring the monastery. There were also a few group activities that wound up being cut, but they still had images in the game. There are a few cut images in Three Houses, most of them from Crimson Flower. We can see support images for Sedith, Flayn, Catherine, and Cyril here, even though these are impossible to see in the final game. Byleth only gets their regular hair color back in Crimson Flower, the one where those 4 characters cannot be recruited. I wonder if they were ever going to be recruitable to Crimson Flower, or if this was just for the sake of completeness. Some images that definitely were for completion are these 4 murals for Part 2. These graphics for the Horsebow, Wyvern, and Red Wolf moons go entirely unused because none of these months see use in Part 2. The last one, the Ethereal Moon, uses a different version for its brief appearance in the game, making this version of the graphic unused. One of the most interesting bits of Three Houses cut content to me comes in the form of betrayals. There was apparently a version of Azure Moon planned where Felix and Annette left your army to show up as enemies. There's even cut boss conversations for this route split. Lawrence was also given an opportunity to betray the Golden Deer in Verdant Wind, with a boss conversation with Claude included. Cut Monastery dialogue also had the Golden Deer grieving his death. The Black Eagles, who were defeated in Classic Mode in Part 1, were once planned to show up as enemies in Silver Snow Part 2. There's a lot of cut dialogue to show these changes too, and there's even a bit of dialogue that remains in the final version to imply the Silver Snow piece, with Edelgard asking Byleth to join her in the opening of Silver Snow, and incorrectly stating that some of the Black Eagles have already chosen to join her. In the end, the vast majority of these betrayals were cut, save for Ash and Lawrence outside of their home routes. But the treachery still has intriguing implications for the story as a whole. Last up for Three Houses, we have the cut difficulty mode of Infernal. Maddening difficulty was added to the game upon a later update, but according to the code, there was originally a 4th difficulty level called Infernal. In the end, this was cut, and the mode still exists in the data despite being almost entirely unusable. Some people have hacked this into the game to see absurdly high stats, and with many enemies hitting their stat caps around the middle of the game. The difficulty is impossible to play fully through too, since many chapters lack the necessary script to set ending flags. This mode was scrapped while still an incomplete mess, so I can't imagine we were ever meant to see it in the final version. Engage, the most recent game in the franchise, has very little known information of what changed during development. The game was revealed in September of 2022 and released worldwide in January of 2023, just 4 months later. A lot of leaks have suggested that Engage was finished for a long time before its release too. Everything we saw during the promotional period came from the finished product of the game. The only real clues we have as to changes in Engage's development come from the unused content. 3 weapons for emblems, Leaf's Master Bow, Ephraim's Sigmund, and Corrin's Dragonfang all have full stats as equipable weapons, even though they're exclusive to Emblem special attacks. The Master Bow and Dragonfang both have icons too, though Sigmund is missing one. Instead, it just has a black lance as its icon. There was a fully usable version of Nell's Dragonstone planned, but it didn't end up being used, and it exists only as an icon. Phoenix Mode also appears to have been planned at this point. Or at the very least, it exists vaguely in the code. It functions well enough, but it doesn't have any animations tied to unit resurrection. I don't know if this was ever planned, but if it was cut pretty early on. Last but not least, there's an unused model for a Dark Emblem sync with Ephraim. In the final game, Erica and Ephraim cannot switch when they are under a Dark sync. He doesn't have any weapons while Dark synced either. In this picture, he is using his regular Sigmund, but Dark Emblems normally have matching dark weapons to avoid a clash of color schemes. Since he was never supposed to appear, he doesn't have any dark weapons. Ephraim also has a lot of voice clips that go unused in the final game, so perhaps a greater role was planned for him at some point, but it wound up being cut later on. Poor Ephraim. He really got the short end of the stick in this game. And so did Engage in terms of developmental change content. But with that, our journey into Fire Emblem's developmental evolution has drawn to a close. Thank you all for joining me today. It really has been a pleasure to show you everything I found. If you want to support me, you can check out my social media profiles as shown on the screen. I'll also have my past EmblemCon informational panels linked for you to check out. This has been Digital Dreams, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.